Welcome to Imagine Otherwise, the podcast about the people and projects bridging art, activism, and academia to build better worlds. Episodes offer in-depth interviews with creators who use culture for social justice and explore the nitty-gritty work of imagining otherwise. I'm your host, Kathy Hanneback. This is episode 52, and my guest today is Karen Tongson. Karen is an associate professor of English and Gender Studies at the University of Southern California. She's also the author of the book Relocations, Queer Suburban Imaginaries, published by NYU Press. Her work has appeared in numerous venues in print and online, including academic journals such as Public Culture, Social Text, GLQ, American Quarterly, and 19th Century Literature, as well as popular venues like BuzzFeed Reader, Public Books, and Sounding Out, the Sound Studies blog. Karen has a forthcoming book with 4Edge Press on why Karen Carpenter matters, which we talk about in the interview, as well as two books in progress, one called Normal Television, Critical Essays on Queer Spectatorship After the New Normalcy, and the second being Empty Orchestra, Karaoke in Our Time. The book series she co-edits with Henry Jenkins at NYU Press, called Postmillennial Pop, has published over a dozen titles. You can hear Karen talk about pop culture, one of her favorite topics, as well as the arts and entertainment industries on the weekly Pop Rocket podcast, hosted by Guy Branum. Karen hails from the legendary Filipino Latin jazz family, the Catandigs. Music and its relationship to space infuses all of her various projects. And in our interview, we talk about the migratory and melodic flows between Manila and Los Angeles, how the Spice Girls can help us understand Adorno and Horkheimer, and the queer and transnational inspiration that Karen draws from her namesake, Karen Carpenter. Karen, welcome, and thank you so much for being with us. I would love to start off hearing about Karen Carpenter, because you have this book about her, and I know that you're named after her. What draws you to Carpenter's work?
There are many ways in which I've felt like I've lived a life not only alongside her music, but with her as this kind of spectral figure and inspiration for a long time. And she connects me in so many ways to being home, this kind of dream, if you will, a kind of Pepsodent smile, white picket fence, perfectly edged lawn, American fantasy that I remember, being inculcated in from such a young age. And so that's part of why I wanted to explore that confluence of feelings. And of course, I love her music as well. It's her voice in particular is really stirring to me. And one of the things I write about in the book is how it was frequently compared to the sound of my mother's own voice when she first started singing.
So you mentioned your familial connection with music, and I'd love to hear a little bit more about that, because you come from a very strong musical family.
Yeah, that's basically the family business. I was born into the Catindig family in the Philippines. That's my mom's side of the family. And everyone on my paternal grandfather's side of the family is essentially a musician, at least of his generation. And her father, Romeo, a.k.a. Romy Catindig, was credited with being one of the earliest innovators of Latin jazz in the Philippines. So really, from his generation onward, music was the family business. And my mom also, that was her first career, was as a professional jazz singer. She still sings now, although she's done a few other things since. She also married a musician. My stepdad, my biological dad, was a singer. They met in a production of Jesus Christ Superstar. They used to sing in bands together that were pretty well known for original Filipino music called OPM, and that band was called Circus Band. So music is essentially, it's the only business that I really knew. And I was on tour with my parents for a long time when I was a kid and really didn't go to formal schools until I was a little bit older.
What made you not go into the music business?
The music industry, as you know, is feast or famine. And we spent a lot of time on the road, sometimes having really wonderful luxe experiences. At other times, it would be very difficult for my family to make a living, for my parents to make a living. I was also an only child, and when we were traveling away from Manila, away from the kind of larger family unit with extended cousins and aunts and uncles, I was the only child, and I felt a little bit lonely on the road. So I was very much attracted to the idea of being able to be in one place for a while. I didn't realize that academia would be as difficult a profession in many respects.
I was going to say, there's some interesting connections there.
Yeah, I mean, it's so funny because my mother used to always say, well, at least you can always teach. You'll have a steady job. You'll always know that you'll be employed. I really, it wasn't until I got deeper into the process when I started graduate school that I understood, oh, shit, what did I get myself into? I might as well become a musician.
Especially with all the moving around, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, I've been lucky enough not to have to move around too much, but it's certainly the insecurity, the job insecurity was something that I meant to avoid by doing something more scholarly or steady, in my mother's words.
Well, you've spun even though you didn't go into the recording industry yourself, or live music yourself, you've spun your kind of interest in sound, in music, in the cultures that are organized around music into both your scholarship, but also your podcast, Pop Rocket. Can you tell folks who might not be familiar with it a little bit about what that covers and what draws you to podcasting?
Well, I sort of fell into podcasting accidentally. It was actually a good friend who I know from the academic pop music worlds, Oliver Wang, who invited me to sit in a few times for this show, Pop Rocket, which is a podcast produced by MaximumFun.org, Jesse Thorne of Bullseye and NPR's company. And so I've sat in a few times as a guest and enjoyed it a lot. And when Oliver decided to pursue other things, they asked me to join the regular panel. Pop Rocket is essentially a hilarious conversation, but a structured conversation about, as we say in our tagline, all the pop culture we love to love. And it's a panel of four. It's hosted by comedian Guy Branum, who is also the host of Talk Show the Game Show. He was on Chelsea lately. He wrote for the Mindy Project. And the panel includes me, journalist and novelist Margaret Wappler, who's also based here in LA, as well as digital strategist Winter Mitchell. And so it's a range of different perspectives, from the scholarly to the zany to inside the industry to the journalistic take. And we cover what we're all about every week, as well as a special topic every week and our favorite gems that week.
My favorite thing about the podcast is the kind of unabashed pleasure that you and the other hosts and guests take in popular culture. It's fun. It's entertaining. You enjoy it, and you aren't afraid to say that you like it. It's like pleasure can be just as valuable, just as scholarly, just as smart as critique.
That's certainly part of it. And I think that one of the things that I sort of decided early on, or at least, after a couple of years of being in graduate school, is that I would no longer repress that pleasure in order to select the proper objects that would dignify my labor, my work, that would dignify my sense of intellectual heft. It's not that I don't take pleasure in those things as well, or in the intricacies of theory and philosophy and other disciplines, but it was important for me to remember that I got into this profession in part because I didn't know it was a profession. I like to write. I like to think about cultural objects. And I wanted to preserve that sensation, that set of affects. And so I decided then that I wouldn't have any shame, after having been shamed a few times for my excursions into things that may have seemed inappropriate or superfluous in more serious contexts. I knew that it would always be a part of my work. It was always a part of the way I thought, analogously between, things that are, more serious and arcane would often be opened up for me by thinking about the Spice Girls. I learned and thought about Adorno and Horkheimer through the Spice Girls, really, in my mind. And that allowed me to understand and access the text in ways that were more salient and ended up being more enduring than if I only cued to the serious or to the severe.
So in addition to the Karen Carpenter book, you're also working on two other ones, right? As if you don't have enough projects on your plate. One on...
I can't. It's very difficult to work on projects simultaneously. I tried to do it for a little while, so now I have them sort of stacked in a scheduled way. So just in case it sounds a little too crazy, I'm just letting you all know, I actually can't work on big projects simultaneously. There has to be one big one and a couple of small ones. Yeah.
Gotcha. No, that's useful because I know a lot of our listeners have questions about workflow and organizing creative versus scholarly projects. So I think this is good information.
Yeah. So I am working on two other projects. The first thing that I'm going to be working on next, which I actually started before I wrote the Carpenter's book. That's another part of my workflow, is that I'll start something and interrupt it with another big project and then get back to it. But the project that I'm going to be working on when I'm on sabbatical for the first time in a while, starting in January, is a book that some people might be familiar with because I've been giving talks about it. It's called Empty Orchestra: Karaoke in Our Time. And it's about, the kind of relationship between karaoke and its modes of repetition and copying. And it's that relationship of that to kind of queer aesthetics, the imitative arts, ways of rethinking the problem or question of imitation and originality in the contemporary age. And it's also about, in many respects, the media archaeology of karaoke, about the different formats and forms that came to being starting about the early 70s. So it's a mix of, all sorts of stuff. Most of my work isn't just straight up one thing or the other. And it's also obviously a very personal work because I, in many respects, already experimented with karaoke as a methodology in my first book, Relocations, precisely singing along to or thinking my way into more gnarly intellectual problems through pop music and pop songs, and having that crack open some of those ideas. And so I'm really kind of interrogating that, and kind of our critical practice alongside our relationship to aesthetic theory and some of the technologies that make available to us different ways of thinking about these problems.
You mentioned your first book, Relocations, which has some really fantastically interesting things to say about space. And I'm curious how that book connects with what you were talking about earlier, with your kind of thinking through on a familial level or a personal level, I guess, questions of home, questions of belonging, questions of land, questions of space. How did you see those things kind of mesh with each other in writing that book?
I really began from that place, and in many respects have always started from that place. The origin story that I was sharing with you in relation to my being named after Karen Carpenter has a lot to do with the different movements I undertook as a young child with my family, mostly non-consensual because I was a kid and they took me wherever they needed to. And so I wanted to think my way through what it means to experience different displacements with different degrees of psychological, emotional, and material impacts. And so, I don't know, I think that everything, it sort of pervades every aspect of my lived experience. It's not just my scholarship. I always think about what it's like to move through space, and what it feels like to be alienated from a space, or to make every effort to transform location in a way that is amenable and resonant for you. And so, it's an approach that I take into every bit of scholarship that I do. The Carpenter's book moves back and forth between Southern California and the Philippines, and follows the music as it, is incubated in Southern California and has a really healthy afterlife in the Philippines. So I think that, it's about understanding oneself in relation to different places, sometimes tenuous relation to different places. And, sort of realizing the significance of that and the profundity of that.
It seems like Southern California plays a pretty big role in a lot of those stories. And I'm originally from Southern California myself. I haven't lived there for a long time. But I'm curious, what do you love about SoCal?
I think, relocation says a lot about it. But one of the things that I love about Southern California, and I think about this in relation to Los Angeles in particular, is that the precisely the thing that people hate most about it, it's impenetrable sprawl without any real logic, is something to me that's really compelling. I've spent a lot of time in a lot of other cities. I've lived in other cities, more vertical, smaller, more amenable to walking cultures. And it's not that I love driving, but I love that Los Angeles, in all of its mysterious sprawl, and Southern California in general, because it's all interconnected, never ceases to surprise me. It never ceases to be transformative in many respects. It never ceases to surprise me in ways that are both affirmative and expressive and wonderful, and yet also horrifying and depressing and worthy of further inquiry. So, I do think that my relationship to Southern California in particular is really driven by this sense of its constant transformations, and the transformations that are wrought by the people who come and flow through this place, from throughout the Pacific Rim, from throughout the hemisphere, Latin America and Central America, from the rest of the country.
A lot of your work, I would say most of your work, engages in some way with issues of social justice, whether that's from a kind of scholarly critique perspective, or your approach to popular culture, or the way that you read the relationship between migration and space. And I'd love to hear a little bit from you about how you conceptualize the kind of braiding of academia, of art, or maybe creative practice and activism, or kind of emphasis on social change across your various projects.
Well, I think of it all as a very holistic process. One of the things that probably upsets me most in relation to, or when thinking about the relationship between activism and the academy, or politics in the academy, is that I'm always really kind of fundamentally irked and depressed by really loud displays of political stances or radical stances that don't have any backing or expression in, I wouldn't say the real world, but in other aspects of scholars' ways of moving through the world and being in the world. So I would say, it's time for us to put our scholarship, our radicality, the things we express about our political commitment to social justice, somewhere other than in the work that we give talks about and receive applause for. Because I do think it's a more holistic relationship that we have to have with the cultural producers, the artists, the people whom we write with, not just about, and whether or not that's creative work or whether or not that's scholarly work. I don't really tend to differentiate between the two, but I do feel that we have to imagine ourselves as collaborators, as comrades, and we have to interact with, engage with the subjects, the objects, the worlds that we instrumentalize intellectually in order to, present ourselves as political and socially just beings. We have to invest the time in being present, in being there, and sometimes in doing that in ways that are quiet and will never appear in our scholarship, or will never appear in the things that will be enumerated that give us promotions or raises or what have you. So I'm very much committed to I suppose it's very California of me to use this phrase, this very holistic approach to understanding our role and relationship to social justice, and that we are but participants and not the end all be all of necessarily activating or translating or describing these things for everybody else.
So this brings me to my favorite question that I get to ask guests, which really gets at the heart of the kind of work that you do, the purpose behind this podcast. Obviously, the title of this is called Imagine Otherwise. And one of the things that I feel privileged to be able to talk with so many smart guests about is their vision of a better world, that world that you're working towards when you teach your classes, when you do your scholarship, when you work with artists and musicians and collaborators on these kinds of projects. What's that world that you're working towards? What kind of world do you want?
Well, if you'd asked me this question about a year ago, I'd probably have a very different answer.
I think a lot of us would. Lots changed.
And I thought about this because it's something that I've really been struggling with. And to be perfectly honest, it's very difficult to see one's way out of the dark and dystopic world that seems to be coming to life before our very eyes. It's rescaled my sense of ambition around the world that we imagine. Because on the daily, I just think, well, I just want the world to exist when I wake up. And so those are very bleak and dark thoughts. But what I hope for is that the work that we do, the way that we interact with the world makes it possible to think about a compassionate, collective relationship to whatever is happening in the world. I mean, that the things that were always most stirring and inspirational for me when I encountered other thinkers who were imagining the worlds that they wanted were places where people were very much connected and tied together in common compassion, in a kind of ethical sense of mutual care. And I think that must happen in whatever material world exists for us, is that we have to find ways to foment joy, love, compassion, understanding between one another, and to give each other strength in whatever material conditions we find ourselves in. And so that's sort of the world that I cling to. I try to imagine, even in moments of feeling utter desolation, at where we've been headed. Of course, I would also love a world where we could at least abate the forms of climate change, the forms of species annihilation that are happening and accelerating much faster and faster. So I want all species beings to find a way to really tap into the kind of compassion, love, and joy that will help us get through and discover something enduring.
Well, thank you so much for being with us and sharing a little bit about how you imagine otherwise.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Imagine Otherwise. Imagine Otherwise is produced by Ideas on Fire, and this episode was created by Christopher Prasad, Michelle Velasquez-Potts, Alexander Sastre, and myself, Kathy Hanneback. You can check out the show notes for this episode on our website at ideasonfire.net, where you can also read about the fabulous guest, as well as find links to the people and projects we discussed on the show.